Good afternoon. At the University of Canberra, as Canberra's university, we always begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people. I've had the privilege of being gifted some language by the Ngunnawal elders, so I'd like to say, Darawa Nuna, Darawa Ngunnawal, Yangu Nelawiri Doni Manyan, Ngunnawal Wari, Darawa Wari, Ningada Dindi, Darawa Ngunnawal Bunyin Jumarala Jinjin. This is Ngunnawal land, and it is land that was never ceded. I'd also like to just say I'm going to give you a world first today as a Vice-Chancellor. I'm going to be a Vice-Chancellor who speaks for 2 minutes and 2 minutes only. I'm going to be a Vice-Chancellor who sticks to the script. And I'm also going to be a Vice-Chancellor who doesn't talk about things they don't know about. So if you want to have a chat about ChatGPT, internet privacy and trust, or any of the issues of health technologies, I'll meet you in the corridors for coffee. It's a real privilege to introduce this session on progressors might be learning in power in the current global geopolitical environment, as is always with technology. The university is very pleased to be supporting Chiefly 2023 in this session. University of Canberra, for the second year running, has been named the world's leading university for reducing inequalities, a theme that is very much part of this conference. I didn't say I wasn't going to be a Vice-Chancellor who isn't proud of his institution. And we've set ourselves the ambition of being Australia's most accessible university, addressing disadvantage through education and being central for fair society, economic growth and social inclusion. So it's absolutely critical, I think, for us and for me as well to learn from our international colleagues. In this session, we will hear from 3 panelists with personal experiences of the issues and challenges being faced, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, from the UK and from Germany. And it's an area of particular passion for me. I grew up in the north of England, and my first job was a youth and community worker. I'm the first of my family to go to university, so I personally can see the power of education to genuinely transform. So I'd like to begin by introducing 3 people. Tim Dixon, who will chair the discussion, Bridget Phillipson, MP and UK Shadow State Secretary for Education, and Laura Christine Kraus from Germany. Bridget Phillipson grew up in Sunderland in northeast England, and after reading history at the university, she worked for a local community before managing a refuge for victims of domestic violence. She entered Parliament in 2010 and served as an opposition whip. After the 2015 general election, she joined the Parliamentary Public Accounts Select Committee, and in April 2020, Bridget was appointed to Keir Starmer's first shadow cabinet as Shadow Chief Secretary for the Treasury, and in 2021, she was promoted to Shadow Secretary for Education. Laura Kraus is a director of More in Common in Germany. She joined More in Common from the think tank Das Progressive Zentrum, and after heading the Future of Democracy program and the development of Democracy Lab for Democratic Innovations, Laura holds a master's degree from the Free University of Berlin and is a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Washington. She was twice named one of the people under 40 to watch in Germany and took part in the 2018 negotiations to form the German coalition government, and is a trusted advisor to key figures in German Scholz government. Tim Dixon is currently based in London and is co-founder of More in Common, which works across the US, UK, France and Germany to counter the threats of polarisation and far-right populism. Tim has led social change projects in more than 20 countries. He's trained as an economist and in the tech sector law, and worked as an economic advisor and chief speechwriter for Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and is the co-author of Australia's leading economics textbook, and have built a leading Australian education publishing business, and I have to say I'm a little bit intimidated. Can I just finish by saying I think the stark contrast between Jim Chalmers' values-based capitalism and some of the things that we're seeing economically in the UK I think will be a really fascinating observations at the moment, and the gap in humanity that is there. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
So thank you very much, Paddy, and it's really great to be home. This National Press Club, for an old political staffer like me, does feel kind of like a second home. I'm very familiar with the rubber chicken. I kind of look at the lunch and I taste the coffee and it brings it all back to me. Escaping from the hill to come down to support some, struggling junior shadow minister who's struggling to fill the room just to get that ABC view that looks like there's lots of people here. So anyway, great to be here. One of the things that I've often heard as I've been working overseas in the last 12 years is how great Australians are on international teams. And people talk about how Aussies are fast learners, they're adaptive, they serve international teams really well. And I've often felt curious, particularly in my time working overseas, how Australians seem to do such a good job learning in international environments. But if you think of our policy making in recent years, we seem to have done a really poor job learning from overseas, from international environments, and applying those lessons back here. Often it seems, if you think of a very wide range of debates from, migration, workforce participation, climate change especially, tax policy, you can think, you name it. The debates often are played out in Australia as if we alone are facing these challenges when they're really, really similar to what other developed democracies are facing around the world. So part of what we want to do with Chifley's contribution to national conversation is sometimes to bring that larger perspective so that we can be faster learners. And I actually think if you reflect back on the Hawke-Keating years, that we probably did a better job in reflecting on international experience and applying lessons back home in the 80s and 90s, oddly, than we have been doing in more recent years, even in the era of globalisation. So what we're hoping to do in this conversation, starting with some reflections from Bridget, particularly relating to her policy portfolio area of education, relating to childcare, family support, so forth, and also her reflection from Sunderland South, her constituency, which I think has quite a lot of similarities to the kind of places that Wayne was mentioning this morning. The LP's got to be winning to hold government. Those regional seats where people feel left behind, there's a sense of neglect, there's a remoteness from the centres of where there's been prosperity and economic growth in recent years. There's probably a lot in Bridget's experience that's very applicable to our situation here. So, Bridget, hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's a real honour and privilege to be with you here today on my very first visit to Australia and in the first year of Anthony Albanese's ambitious Labour government. Australia is once again showing us the way ahead, the light on the hill which still shines, and I'm delighted to be able to learn from you as well, because the challenges that you met in winning back power, the discipline that you showed and the focus that you kept are the challenges that we now face in the UK, and the challenges to which you're rising in power, of how we make the social and economic infrastructure of our countries fit for our age, of sustaining an office the ambition nurtured through long years out of it. They are the challenges that we hope to face. And in both of our countries, after long years of right-wing rule, those challenges loom large. But to see the challenges of our time simply as repairing the damage we inherit is to fail. Our ambition must always be greater than building a better yesterday. And in July this year, it will be 75 years since Britain's post-war Labour government introduced not just our National Health Service, but the modern social security system which sits around it. And I know that it's 50 years next year since Medibank first passed into law here in Australia. In every generation, Labour governments have risen in Australia and in Britain to the challenges not just of their times, but of the challenges ahead. Because the light on the hill is always in front of us, never behind us. And it's central to our politics that tomorrow can and will be better than today, and that our greatest days are yet to come. Now, in Britain, our Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has spoken of the perils of sticking plaster politics, of a politics that only engages with the symptoms in front of us, not the deeper wounds behind them. Short-termism, not just in the solutions that get advanced, but the problems that they identify. Because the challenges that are the greatest are rarely the ones that arrive most suddenly. And the solutions aren't always simple, nor technical, not cheap. But the governments that solve those problems and the systems they create are the leaders that we remember and the institutions that endure. And today, one of the greatest challenges that we face is provision for our children and families. Because the peacetime story of Britain over 3 generations has been many things, but in particular, it has been a story of the changing shape of families. Not of women entering the workforce, because women have always worked, but of women entering the paid labour market, of women economically active outside the home. And in Britain, women's economic activity increased by nearly 2.5 times over the period from 1951 to 2018. 3 generations of progress have narrowed inequality within families. There is still a long way to go, but we have come a long way. But the searing inequality between families remains. Inequality which scars our society and holds back our people. And above all, it is our children who pay the price. Now, for parties like ours, with the values that we share, with the focus that we have, which we must have on owning the future, thinking about our children and the world that they will inherit and shape should be central to our government's vision and programme. Because children are not simply a phase in the lives of their parents, nor simply the workers who fill the jobs to come and the economy for which we plan, but they are the citizens of the future, the artists, the scientists, the activists and campaigners, the inventors, critics, thinkers and poets, and of course, the voters. Today's children are tomorrow's society. And in Britain, we see every day how that vision is missing from government. But in Australia, we see not only a government that shares our values, but a steely determination to make them real. A government with not just a vision, but a hunger for change. And back home, during my 14 months in this post, I've been up against no fewer than 5 education secretaries. A different education secretary for every school term. The only change on offer at the moment from Britain's government is the dynamism that comes from rearranging the deck chairs. And the contrast is spectacular, that to come here and to see the change that you are making, and to be reminded so powerfully of what a government that believes in itself can achieve, with the people, for the people, and for good. Climate targets that meet the challenge the whole world faces for generations ahead. A rising minimum wage, because growth that matters is growth for everyone. Expanding university education, because opportunity should be for all of our young people, not just for some of them. Strengthening Medicare, and closest to my heart, making quality childcare more affordable for working families. Because around the world, fixing childcare is the greatest challenge of our time. Not all of us have children, but all of us were children. And the best start for every child today is the best promise of a better tomorrow. Labour in Britain is determined that we will build that better tomorrow. We will build a modern childcare system, not just fit for today, but for the future we need, with a focus not just on our smallest children, but on every child, looking towards a system that stretches throughout their lives, from the end of parental leave right through to the end of primary school, that stretches those days to support parents with the choices that they make, and that integrates the joined-up education that young people deserve, that empowers all of our children to achieve and thrive, that matches the needs of families with the help that government can provide, and that ensures that the people who deliver that start for our children have the respect that they deserve. That is why when I set out the approach that Labour in UK will take to build that modern childcare system that we need, the very first step was for our school-age children, breakfast clubs for every child in every primary school. Because the evidence is clear that they improve attainment for children through the club, not just the breakfast. And the unions are clear that it gives working parents more choices. And our schools are clear that they benefit from the social framework, the Healthy Start. And Labour is clear that offering change that binds together a coalition is the route to a better future for us all. And I'm determined that we will learn from right across the world about how we do right by our children. The reform agenda of Britain's next Labour government will not just be informed by understanding what needs to change at home. It will be lit up with the knowledge and experience of progressive governments around the world. We are determined that in modernising Labour government, we define ourselves not just against the government we replace, but for the future, through the future that we deliver. That we look beyond making today's system sing to moving to the better answers we need for tomorrow. It's why I visited Estonia, to see a childcare system that supports every family and every school. Why I'm learning from Ireland, where governments and union together have agreed an approach that delivers for children, delivers for families, delivers for the workforce and for the economy. And it's why I'm so pleased to be here today, to be listening to Jason Clare on Monday and to be visiting a childcare centre to meet the most important stakeholders of all. And lastly too, we are determined that a better system will endure. We know, as you know, how easy it is for governments of the right to dismantle the achievements of Labour governments. The last Labour government in Britain delivered not just a network of children's centres which transformed the lives of our youngest children in every corner of our country, but a level of real terms investment in our schools which the Tories have still not matched. Across England, thousands of children's centres have now been closed over 13 years of Conservative government. School budgets squeezed, school buildings crumbling. And so the coalition for change that we need is to bring parents together across families, across our country and across the age range too. And to move from thinking of services as institutions to improve, to thinking of them as the tools with which we craft the chances of the generation ahead of us. I was born a few months after Bob Hawke took office in Australia, a time some of you will remember, the beginning of a succession of election victories, which in Britain we have yet to match. Our Labour Party has sadly less of a record of success. My mum brought me up alone in a time and in a country where families were judged by the shape that they had, not the love that they gave. And that changed with Labour. But the first general election in which I voted in Britain back in 2005 was the last time that Labour won. Young people will be voting in Britain's next general election who have never lived through a Labour victory. 2/3 of my life has been spent under Conservative governments in Britain. And I'm determined that Labour's success here last year is the model we follow in winning the next election at home. Because just as Anthony changed Labour here, Keir Starmer has changed Labour back at home. Changed it for good. Change for the better, a change that will endure. Under Keir, Labour has turned a corner. A leadership and a party looking outwards to victory, not inwards for legitimacy. No longer a party of protest, but a party of public service. We are a party not just ready to win, but ready to govern. Ready not just to take power, but to use it. With a mission for change, which we will take from transforming our party to transforming our nation. Putting children, education and families at the heart of that challenge. Putting these issues centre stage in our debates. Defining the difference between the parties, not on who promises what for today, but on who can deliver for our children tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I wonder, reflecting on the conversation that we had just before the lunch on the Hawke-Keating legacy, I think the aspiration for many of us in this room is for 2022 to be an inflection point for Australia in the way that 1972 was, 1983 was, and for Conservatives, 1996 was as well. The challenge, and I reflect on this a lot in the case of where Keir Starmer has brought the Labor Party in terms of electability now compared to December 2019 is absolutely extraordinary. But there is such a challenge as well that the context that we're operating in is one of continual crises and emergencies. You think of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, that one of the big challenges that progressive governments face is just managing these crises while the public's also expecting us to make progress on some of the really hard issues. So I wonder if it's useful for us, as we, in this conversation now, we'll be thinking about the challenge of the progressive governing agenda in a time when we have certainly significantly more progressive governments in power now than we did a few years ago. And we think of the United States and Germany, as Laura will be speaking of, France, centrist government. But you also have, in the UK, quite likely next year, and obviously our conversation here in Australia. But you also have the examples of Italy and Sweden where things have gone the other way, and so we're in an environment of political change. It goes, both ways. So the conversation now that we want to sort of focus on is a little bit thinking towards the aspiration of how 2022 could be that kind of inflection point that I think the public actually wants in Australia. To get to that aspiration, we kind of need to understand what's distinctive about the context that we're now operating in. And so maybe that we'll sort of have a few reflections and comments on that, and then we'll open up for questions. So, Laura, just sort of turning to you, what do you think is distinctive about the current era and how progressive governments can respond to the distinctive challenges of the 2020s?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come here. We just shared that it's both of our first trips to Australia. So I'm very excited to speak about German progressive politics here, very far away from home. But I think we're actually in a very similar situation with the newish Scholz government in Germany. Olaf Scholz won the election in September 2021 after 16 years of conservative leadership under Angela Merkel, where the Social Democrats were part of the government because we have a thing for coalitions, but did not win an election since 2002. So we have the same situation that there are many young voters who just kind of knew Angela Merkel as their chancellor. And he managed to win on a campaign that was centered around respect. That was sort of the key message. And a lot of discipline in the Social Democratic Party. But almost the only reason why it turned out differently than in Sweden was that his prospective coalition partners had enough of votes so that he was able to form a three-party coalition government, which we call the traffic light coalition, because the Social Democrats are red, the Greens are green, obviously, and the Liberal Party is yellow. So German media likes to come up with catchy phrases for our coalitions, and that's the situation that we have. And I think there were high hopes connected to that win, especially within the Social Democratic Party, to really advance a progressive agenda after that long reign of Angela Merkel, which in the end was a lot of management, but not a lot of vision. But I would say that, getting to your question of what is the era we live in, is that Scholz has to govern in a very different environment than Merkel had to. Because for one, what becomes really apparent in recent years, and that's part of our work also at More in Common, is that democratic governments everywhere really have to deal with a trust crisis, and with growing mistrust by citizens in the political elites, in sort of the ability of political systems to deliver on big challenges like climate change, and in the better future that you talked about. You know, I see that in my work every day, and in the research we do at More in Common, that people don't really believe in that. And that is a different environment to navigate than, I would say, the Germany of 10 years ago, sort of where people didn't have those high levels of mistrust yet. And the other one, quite obviously, is the new geopolitical reality in Europe. So Scholz, 3 months into government, had to sort of announce the Zeitenwende, as he coined it, sort of the watershed moment for German foreign policy and energy policy. And Germany really had to come to grips with a lot of things we told ourselves about our role in Europe and our role in the world. And so managing these two things at the same time, I would say, is very challenging and is something that's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's this challenge of managing or repairing trust at home while working on the big challenges. And maybe one example to share what that could look like, but how challenging it also is on the cost of living crisis that has hit Germany just like other countries, where we actually conducted research as More in Common into what fears people have and what they expect from the government. And kind of sort of for many political stakeholders we talked to, counterintuitively, people wanted both quick repair and the long-term plan. Because in COVID, they mostly saw quick repair, and they got really disenchanted with that because they felt like it was sort of this weird strategy of turning this way, turning that way. So there's really this thirst for a bigger plan for the future. I think somebody on the stage earlier talked about the narrative. And we can get a bit more into communication and narratives a bit later maybe, but I think that's really key, to do both, to really give people the feeling that we're taking care of you now, but we're also thinking about the future.
Jim Chalmers' article in The Monthly that we've had a couple of references to today, he reflected that these crises that progressive governments are facing have a common element, which is vulnerability, that they increase people's sense of vulnerability, which I reflect was a particularly interesting point, because one of the findings in More in Common's research is that possibly actually the single biggest gap in psychological terms between progressive voters and in British terms, it's the red wall voters, but it's the traditional party base that's shifted right or is more open to shifting right, and particularly to voting for populists in recent years. The biggest single gap psychologically is that progressive voters' personal experience of security is quite strong. Relatively small numbers of base progressive voters have a personal experience of insecurity. That is, their lives are pretty secure, and partly because more highly educated, live in big cities, don't know economic precariousness as much. On the other hand, and it's not just a matter of economic insecurity, it's also a sense of place in society. It's men feeling more disrespected. It's people not having a job that gives them a sense of status or a sense of place in the world. Anyway, the issue is vulnerability, basically, and that those people are significantly more responsive to messages of fear and then promises of false security, the false security of the populist sort of message. So with that reflection that vulnerability is a key element which really emerges in the cost of living piece that you're describing, I'm interested in your reflection on how governments find solutions that make progress, that answer that sense of vulnerability at a time when there is such low levels of trust. I mean, are there examples that you've seen where you can navigate this kind of time of division and insecurity and deliver and make people feel like you're actually delivering for them?
Well, I think in German policymaking, sort of the fear of polarization is always there, even though I would say Germany is not as polarized as other countries, and we certainly don't have this sort of left-right division as strongly because of our political system. But it's always sort of, it always has a seat at the table, and that sometimes is a good thing and then sometimes is a bad thing. But I think the vulnerability where it was balanced well was in a big piece on transportation that the government passed last year, because one of the biggest issues sort of in alleviating the cost of living crisis in Germany was transportation. Sort of to give you an idea, Germans travel a lot by train within the country, but Germans love their cars. It's a big piece of German identity still. But the furthest drive you can take in Germany is about 950 kilometers if you go north to south. That's it. Sort of, you're leaving the country after that.
That's a daily commute in Australia.
Yeah, that's what I thought, right? And there was really a lot of contentious debate around how do you deal with that piece of the cost of living crisis, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't feed into polarization or that doesn't feed into the vulnerability, but makes people feel seen. And what the government came up with, not so different than other countries, but it did two things. It did a discount on fuel for 3 months, and it did a €9 ticket, which was essentially you could use public transport in all of Germany for €9 for the whole month. And you could really travel the country that way. And what was really interesting to see is that this measure, especially for pundits and for political advisors, was counterintuitive, because they thought this doesn't make sense because you're paying for people to drive and you're paying for people to take public transit. Wouldn't it be better to just go one way or another? But for people, and we saw this in our polling, it fed into exactly what I was talking about earlier, that it was something for everybody right now. It catered to both urban and rural groups. But it had an element of building something for the future, because this €9 ticket ended up being such a success that, well, trains were too full, so that was the problem. But the German states are about to pass a €49 ticket that's going to stay for good. And that would have been unthinkable a year ago, really, if you had told me a year ago that Germany would do that and that the German federal states would get together on that idea. So I think there was a very conscious and good policy choice in that instance by the Scholz government to. And what's interesting about his government is that because of the spread between Green and Liberals and Social Democrats, they have to do a lot of negotiating within the coalition, but that actually represents a bigger piece of the population and these cultural contentions out there.
That's a great practical example of a policy. I wonder if we might just move to the larger challenge of one of the defining characteristics, and I know Moran Collins' research shows this in all across the world, US, UK, France, Germany, Poland, that people sense their countries being deeply divided and if you ask the question, does the country feel more divided than any point in the rest of, in my lifetime? Very large majorities of people say yes to that, and I haven't seen similar polling in Australia, but intuitively I think that, get a similar sense, particularly under the previous government. I wonder what are you learning about how progressive governments navigate an environment of more fractured and polarised societies?
Well, I think the sentiment of felt polarization is actually quite important, and I think it has a lot to do with our media system also and social media being built the way they are, because social media elevates division or elevates moments where you disagree. In Germany, we don't have the Murdoch media, so we don't have some elements of your environment you're navigating in, let me phrase it that way. But we certainly have similar challenges in that way. And I think what is really hard for progressive governments right now is that a lot of what's happening in society is counterintuitive. A lot of the things from the old playbook, I think, don't make sense anymore. So just to give you an example of that, as you, I'm sure, are aware, there was a long debate about whether Germany should send tanks to support Ukraine and how that could be done. And when you ask Germans whether they're in favor now of this decision to send the Leopard 2 tank or not, Green supporters are in favor of it, 75%. Traditionally, Greens in Germany were pacifist, and they were part of the peace movement. That's where they came from. But 75% of Green supporters support this, and only 53% of Germans overall. That is completely counterintuitive that the Greens are in the forefront, sort of arming up and doing these things. And so I think that's a big challenge to navigate that environment that we talked about earlier. And to not sort of, I often see policymakers build in the polarization into their politics. So for example, we did a big report on social cohesion and climate change in Germany. Because it's one of the issues where we saw the biggest risk for division after migration. And what we found is that 80% of Germans say they're worried about the climate. But people feel like, especially activists, feel like they're alone in the fight. So what we were then able to do to take that research both to policymakers and to activists from the climate movement and show them, look, it's not the moment of agenda setting maybe, but now it's the moment of how do we get into collective action. And Germans are really asking, we hear that in our focus groups that we're doing a lot, they really want the government to set the framework. They don't want citizens to have to do these, they have to reach these decisions individually, because it's a big burden on people. So a lot of people say, look, I want to do something for the climate, but I want the government to kind of set the framework and I will move within that framework. So that was also sort of a counterintuitive finding for a lot of people because they thought this was a conflict, but this was mainly a conflict because we feel like we have to fight this out with our parents or we have to fight this out with our neighbors. But actually people want a wider societal push so it can be dealt with at that level.
In a moment, we'll turn to questions, but I just wonder on that question of navigating polarisation, Bridget, if you could come in on the question of Britain's obviously gone through the very divisive Brexit period, that the Brexit identities have clearly weakened compared to where they were, you know, in it's 7 years ago now, isn't it, the referendum. How do you imagine a Labor government successfully navigating those divides?
I mean, I think you're right that there is a degree to which people want to put much of that division behind us. We spent a very long time, not just in the run-up to the referendum, but then subsequently Brexit was the focus of so much of what was going on. And I think possibly an under-discussed feature of the 2019 election was the degree to which people, regardless of how they had voted, just wanted politics to become less chaotic, less divisive, and for a government just to be getting on with doing the things that government should do. I think part of the difficulty that the Conservatives have at the moment is that none of that has actually come to pass. We've seen even more chaos and even more division. And so many of the basics are just not being done right. So, when you talk of voters feeling insecure, I mean, there is a massive degree of concern and insecurity where it comes, including amongst older voters, around the pretty terrible situation our National Health Service has been in recent months, where people, including those who've had strokes or heart attacks, are routinely waiting up to an hour and a half for an ambulance to come. And, you can be economically secure, but all of us need to know that emergency care will be there and readily available. And But I think part of the challenge that we in Labour in the UK have is at a point where people have become so mistrusting of politics more broadly, where the degree to which politics can affect positive change in people's lives is really at risk. You sometimes get a sense from some voters that they feel that, can anyone really make a difference here, and how can politics change my life? And that will be part of the big challenge that we will face at the next general election, is not just identifying the problems, because they're there for everyone to see, including people for whom politics might not otherwise intrude in their lives so much, but what are the tangible steps that we will be taking to make life better. Now, we've talked a lot about some of what those practical steps will be, but Keir Starmer has also talked about the need for a decade of national renewal, because the scale of the crisis that we face in so many of our public services will take a long time to put right. And as a party of the left, there remains a constant need to demonstrate how importantly we take managing the economy, and something where you face attacks, we've faced attacks. Actually, the record of the last Labour government where it came to the economy was a very strong one, but we still face that constant need to demonstrate that we take our responsibility seriously, that we'll spend taxpayers' money wisely. But then the balance that we have alongside that is the parlous state of our public services alongside the public finances. So I think setting out that vision about how it will take, being realistic with voters, being upfront about how long it will take to put some of this right, with steps in the short term, but a longer term vision about how we get there, I think is an important part of seeking to regain that trust amongst voters as well.
Yeah, there's on this piece of how you lead in polarised times, there's a terrific interview that Catherine Murphy did with Anthony Albanese. I think it was late 2018, it might have been 2019. I was trying to find it on the plane on the way over, and I couldn't track it down, but I might see if I can track it down. I'll put the link on the Chifley website. But it struck me listening to, it's partly because Albo's an experienced politician who's been through a lot. He's had time in government, in and out. He's seen failure as well as success, which I think can be very helpful. Joe Biden actually similarly in the US has got that sense of, he intuitively gets people's exhaustion with politics. And there's something about how you respond to crises, which I see, and Keir's obviously not been in the leadership position and is yet to be a Prime Minister, but he seems to also have that sense of where the public doesn't want more political conflict, wants delivery. But it's tough to deliver when you've got high expectations. So maybe that's a particularly strong challenge that this era we face. But let's open up for questions. Let's maybe if we take 2 or 3 questions first up, and then we'll have responses. But we'll start over here, if we can get the mics over. There is on the way.
Yes, I'm Charlie Lewis. I guess this question is for Bridget, but also the other panel members. That is the role of Blue Labour, the Blue Labour approach, and the what they hope to achieve. Has that impacted much on the British Labour Party at this stage? I know it has some strong adherents there. It does over here too. Like Nick Dyrenforth is a very keen supporter. And interestingly, Jim Chalmers made some very positive comments on his book, and also Adrian Pabst's book, Our Country, Our Future. He was very positive about that too. So there may be some interest at higher levels here, but I'm just interested to see how it might be playing out.
Great. Let's take a couple more and then we'll do answers. So here and then, yeah. Just hold on a moment and we'll grab the mic.
NHS is in dire straits, which it is. In fact, much like our Medicare system here, it's underfunded. The government needs to increase funding by 50% or maybe even 100%. Question is, how do you do that? That's the question. How do government come up with funding? It's why politics is on the nose with everyone. I mean, you say you're going to do something, but when you get in, you won't be able to fund, it doesn't matter who's in. Same problem here. Albo won't be able to do much with our Medicare system. You wait and see. They won't be able to, because we've got $1 trillion debt, and we've got to care for the budget. It's like a household budget. It's all bullshit, of course, but I'm wondering, how do you intend to increase the budget?
Okay, and we've got one more over here, and then we'll...
Hello, my name is Anana. I'm a former student of political science and mass communication at American University of Paris. I'm in Canberra for 10 years now. I used to be a journalist in Cambodia for many international media. My question to the UK is that how many % of the Labour MP are from the state school backgrounds? And who are the major donor for the Labour Party in UK, and who is your adversary? For example, in Australia, the mining company doesn't like the Labour Party. I just want to know which group that doesn't like the Labour Party in UK. And the question for the Germany, Guten Abend. I just wonder which political party in Germany support the multiculturalisms and refugee. Thank you.
Great. Bridget, sorry, this is worse than a press conference, but over to you.
I'll start on the topic of state education. It's a fact that a lot more Labour politicians are state educated than Conservative politicians in the UK, although politicians are still disproportionately more likely to have been privately educated than state educated. I mean, that is changing over time, and probably less so in the Conservative Party than it is in Labour. I mean, I'm very proudly educated at my local state schools, and feel very strongly that's where we should devote our efforts. I mean, what we've been talking about quite a lot in the UK, and it's generated quite a lot of attention, is around taking away the tax benefits that private schools enjoy. They still enjoy considerable tax benefits, and I don't think that can be justified. So, that's a clear commitment, and that goes to part of the question around how you raise money to fund public services. We'd be raising a not insubstantial amount of money by ending those tax breaks that we would put directly into our state schools. And we will absolutely do that from government. I mean, part of the answer where it comes to how you make sure you can invest more in your health services or public services across the board, the last Labour government in the UK did that by growing our economy, and that will be the central challenge that the next Labour government in the UK would face, because economic growth has been absolutely abysmal for the last decade or so. And if you look at the levels of NHS investment that we've seen, it's been historically kind of beneath the post-war average over that period. Now, the challenge that we face and that you will face is that after a long period of opposition, you can't right every wrong straight away, but how you do demonstrate that you are making positive change. And that will be an acute problem for the next Labour government if we're fortunate enough to form it, because the public finances will be in even more difficult state, and the state of the economy will be even more severely damaged, both in terms of its short-term prospects, but also the wider foundations, far more than was the case in 1997, where there was, growth had begun to emerge. The UK, our economy is not performing well, and part of the argument that I've been seeking to make around the need for a modern childcare system is that will be a part of how we support economic growth, because we simultaneously face a problem with women in particular giving up work because they can't manage childcare and work, grandparents cutting back on hours to look after children because childcare just isn't available. So what those kind of tangible steps that we can take to demonstrate how we get our economy growing again. On the question around Blue Labour, it's not my politics. I think it has, Blue Labour have contributed to some elements of the debate where it comes to, I think, recognising where voters are and the need to persuade in taking people with you and building a coalition. I think some of the danger, and this is always a danger, I think, for parties of the left, is that it does have a tendency to be rather backward-looking rather than future-facing, not recognising how society has changed and embracing some of that change and designing kind of policy and political solutions that move with the grain of change rather than looking backwards. Now, to take an example, I'm from the northeast of England, somewhere where we had a very long and proud mining tradition, shipbuilding, heavy industry. That's all gone, and life has changed significantly. Now we've got advanced automotive, we've got manufacturing, And actually, we're at the forefront of much of the technological advance that we will see around climate change. But I'd much rather be focused on what the positive solutions are in dealing with the challenges that we face and in creating jobs now, rather than talking about some of what happened in the past and what jobs and people's lives were then. Because those days of kind of heavy unionised, male-dominated workforces, where people lived very close together and lived, worked relatively close to where they live, those days in the UK are gone and they aren't coming back. So I think we do need to look to the future in designing our policy solutions.
And Laura, did you just want to pick up on the politics of refugees, multiculturalism in Germany?
Yeah, and if you allow, I would also add a comment on what Bridget just said, and sort of, because when I reflected coming over here, what are commonalities and differences between our countries, I feel like there's a commonality for Labour or social democratic parties that they usually don't get into office when it gets very easy. It seems, at least in Germany, I can say that whenever the SPD gets the chancellorship is where it gets really difficult. It seems to be a pattern. So if you have anything to share on that from Australia, I would be welcome to hear from that, because I think there are also life cycles to things going on in our countries, and everything that you just raised about the health system, and certainly in Germany also about the pension system, we have the same challenges, that especially younger people are wondering what is in that for them, and it's going to be really difficult to sort of move the levers on that. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, and I think, and you alluded to it, Bridget, is that how key communication in all of this is. And I think that is a difference also in governing that Scholz is actually not handling so well yet, because he's not a huge communicator. And he would have been fine the way he is 10 years ago, but he's not fine anymore in the environment we're in right now, both in explaining to his own citizens as well as to international partners what he's doing, and so I think explaining well and amping up communication is key to everything I think we've discussed today. And that brings me to the question about migration, multiculturalism in Germany, because that's actually one parallel I see with Australia. Germany has an aging society. Our population is declining because Germans are not having enough children, unlike a lot of our neighbors, and we actually need migration sort of to keep up the social welfare system, but especially under conservative rule, even though we had the big migration movement in 2015, and obviously right now from Ukraine, it's a very difficult topic. But actually what the current government is doing is really trying to change routes to German citizenship. So there were some really fundamental changes to German citizenship law in the pipeline. And to answer your question, that is traditionally that would have been the Green Party mostly pushing for that, but it is also Social Democrats and the Liberals, which is kind of the new thing because they look at it more from a business perspective. So that has yet to be passed, but if it is passed, it would really be a game changer in German, in routes to becoming German.
Great. Let's have 3 more questions and we'll then take some final remarks. Just here first.
Just wanted to sort of go to particularly what, Laura, you were speaking about in terms of, Tim was speaking about in terms of vulnerability and people with insecure backgrounds that are really just moving straight from a, in some circumstances they're moving from being a Labor voter right across to the right or to the left. And also just pairing up with what Laura was talking about with respect to politics becoming quite counterintuitive. I was thinking, looking at the booth numbers in the seat of Griffith in Brisbane, went from a Labor held to a Green held. A lot of that was actually not because of Labor voters moving green, but actually Liberal National Party voters missing a stop on the political spectrum and going straight to the Greens. Something like 20%, 30% in some booths. And that was enough to really, win the day quite strongly. I guess my question is, how do you speak to these people that are moving, very quickly and sort of counterintuitively from being, perhaps a Labor voter, right across to the far political left and even the political right? They're looking for simple answers to complex questions. Unfortunately, that sort of way of discussing the issues with those people, it doesn't really cut it and it doesn't convince them. So thinking about, how you might be doing that in your conversations.
Great, and we had a question from the lady in green.
Hi, Judy Anderson. Talking about the issue of progressive governments, new policies, making new ground, and the stickability issues that you talked about, and it sort of ties into what's happening in Germany. How do we deal with the extreme right and the extreme left in that environment so that they don't tear down what's been built? And we saw that with Tony Abbott and having a carbon reduction scheme.
Great, and we had a third question, I think, over in this direction. Yep.
Thank you. Bridget, you've spoken about a conservative rule over the UK across the decade, and I think domestically we've seen in an Australian election recently that our priorities are changing and voters' priorities are changing. And this is a bit of a loaded question, so I just wanted to ask, if elected, what would a Labor government do to support multiculturalism and uplift minority groups, both stereotypically and institutionally across the UK? And also, following the Foreign Minister's comments, what would a Labor government do differently when acknowledging the UK's colonial past? I'm sorry, but it has to be asked.
That's a loaded one. Bridget, do you want to start with a response?
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I was on the plane when that was all being discussed. So I think where it comes to race equality in the UK, what Keir Starmer set out is that we would bring forward a Race Equality Act to ensure that we do have genuine equality right across society. That also applies where it comes to the curriculum as well. So we're looking very carefully at how we have a curriculum that reflects, within our schools, that reflects the lives that young people live today, that the communities in which they live and the diversity of our society. I do have to say that we do face real and genuine challenges where it comes to making sure that all of our citizens have opportunity in life. And of course, that is absolutely true where it comes to race equality as well. We do still have systemic issues, but I do also believe that we do have some strengths in demonstrating how we are a welcoming society on the whole in Britain. And, my family came to the UK from Ireland, so I won't drift too much into this discussion around colonialism. It was a source of lively discussion while I was growing up as well, with a different kind of perspective. But I do think it is about recognising Britain's role in the world now and today. Where it comes to forging, I think, a different vision about Britain looking outwards, we've in recent years been, I think, too focused on looking inwards as a country. And we do need to look outwards to the world. Now, that does include, of course, reflecting on our history, and I think it is important that we consider Britain's history too, but also looking to the relationships that we need to forge into the future. So partly that is around how we make sure that we've got a better relationship with our European partners and neighbours as well, but also right across the world too. And, what Keir Starmer has also rightly been talking about is the need for Britain's economy to be more outward-looking where it comes to exports as well, because, again, a big part of the challenge that we face right now is around the kind of weakness, the fundamental weaknesses that we see within our economy, and how we use that as a basis to build a better society for everyone in Britain too, where opportunity and wealth is more evenly shared right across our citizens.
Thanks. And Laura, just on our other questions on the extremes and the political shifts.
Very easy to answer how to deal with the extreme left and extreme right in 2 minutes, but I will give it a go, and I will try to answer both questions at the same time, because what you asked about how to deal with these voters who sort of move to what we might perceive as sort of counterintuitively is, I would say, listen to them, try to understand them as best as possible, and try to let go of language that maybe means a lot to you, because there are concepts attached to it, that have a great significance for the Labour Party, for example, because that's something we always see working with our partners in politics and in civil societies, that often we use concepts and words that mean a great deal to us. And then we test them in focus groups and they're just these empty shells for people, you know, they mean nothing to them. And so especially with disengaged voters or hard to reach audiences, that is often really listen to them, how they speak and what they speak about, and try to start from there. And maybe just on the extreme right and left, this election in Germany was actually the first one where the Social Democrats in a long time won the blue-collar worker vote. The SPD actually didn't win it before, in the 2 elections before. So the message of respect really had a resonance. But unfortunately, that narrative is not really carried into the government work. So I think that's something to really look for. Is the narrative consistent? What do you carry into the work? And because when speaking of the extreme right, you cannot allow it to control the narrative. And that's what they're very good at least in the context that I work in. They're very good at controlling the narrative and setting the agenda, and people still kind of jump for that, you know? So and also to challenge media on that, frankly, I know it's an uphill battle, but to do that would be my recommendation. The extreme left in Germany, I have to say, with the whole Russia stand that they have, really sort of took off its mask, so they're really less of an issue right now. But and we can be glad that they're not in government, frankly.
Yeah, and I just add one final remark, and I know that we're just hitting time, but you know, one of the most profound political lessons for me has been, we run a lot of focus groups in the UK, US. I'm not German speaking, so we can't listen to the German ones, but there's just something fascinating about, it's only about 1 in 3 people today have an attachment to a political party. Like if you ask them, in terms of your identity, is your politics, is a political party important to them, important to you? Only 1 in 3 say yes. It's hard to see that if you're on social media, because among that small proportion who are highly engaged, they're more tribal, more deeply engaged with their identity than ever. So you've got these, you know, strong political identities making a lot of noise, but actually for most people, politics has that distance. So how you then speak to that, well, I just find it's been such an education for me, I mean, first in my role here, you know, listening to focus groups, but now doing a lot. There is a different experience of the world that most people have, and there's a great podcast that Sarah Longwell in the US has, which is just called The Focus Group, where all she does is just focus groups, and you just listen to it, and you're getting the privilege of getting an inside perspective that, you know, normally, traditionally, it's only the people in the party head office have been able to, but it totally reorientates your way to think about how you campaign when you just hear, you know, for people who are absorbing so much, engaging so much less with politics and absorbing just little bits and pieces. And sometimes the oddest things really cut through, and other times they've really got a good grasp, and other times they haven't heard of something that you think has kind of overwhelmed and taken over your world for weeks. So one piece is just a constant challenge in this tribalised world of how we are in touch and stay in touch and find ways to have normal conversations with people outside of our social media world.